didn't expect anything unusual. But a chance discovery of a hidden staircase led to events that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. Emily had always believed that habits were a kind of quiet anchor. They kept life from drifting too far in any direction, especially after everything she had been through. Every morning followed the same gentle rhythm, and every evening ended with the same promise she made to herself. No matter how heavy the day felt, she would go back to the forest. The forest never asked questions. It never expected explanations. It simply existed, vast and patient, offering silence in exchange for nothing at all. She lived in a small town in the northern part of the United States, the kind of place where people nodded at each other at gas stations and remembered your name after a few visits. Emily had moved there 3 years earlier, leaving behind a city that never slept and a life that had grown too loud. The town was modest, surrounded by open land and thick stretches of woodland that seemed to begin where the last houses ended. For most people, the forest was just scenery. For Emily, it was refuge. She worked a quiet job that paid the bills and demanded little of her beyond attention and patience. When her shift ended, she drove home, changed into worn hiking boots and a weathered jacket, and reached instinctively for the leash hanging by the door. The leash belonged to Luna, her dog, a medium-sized mixed breed with alert eyes and an intelligence that often felt unsettlingly human. Emily had adopted Luna from a shelter shortly after moving to town, drawn to the dog's calm presence and the way she watched the world with cautious curiosity. They had healed together in their own ways, forming a bond built not on words, but on shared silence. Their routine was simple and rarely varied. Emily would load Luna into the car, roll the windows down just enough to let in the scent of pine, and drive the familiar road leading north. The asphalt gradually narrowed, the houses thinning until they disappeared altogether. She passed the same old mailbox, leaning at an angle, the same rusted sign warning about wildlife crossings, the same bend in the road where the trees suddenly opened up and the forest revealed itself in full. Every detail had become a landmark, etched into her memory through repetition. The parking area was little more than a widened patch of gravel at the edge of the woods. There were no signs, no fences, no official markers to suggest that this was a starting point for anything at all. Emily liked that. It felt unofficial, unnoticed, as if the forest allowed her entry only because she approached quietly and without expectation. She parked in the same spot every time, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound as the car cooled. Before stepping out, she always checked her phone. The signal was weak here, often dropping to a single bar or disappearing altogether. She had learned not to rely on it, but the habit remained. She opened a message thread and typed a brief line to her closest friend, a simple statement she had sent dozens of times before. Heading into the forest, back later. It was not dramatic or fearful, just practical. If something went wrong and she didn't return by nightfall, someone would know where she had last been. Once the message was sent, she slipped the phone into her pocket and stepped out into the cool air. The forest greeted her the same way it always did, with a quiet that was not empty, but layered. There was the distant sound of water moving over stones, the whisper of leaves brushing against one another, the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. Sunlight filtered down through the canopy, breaking into scattered patches that shifted slowly with the movement of the branches above. The air smelled of damp earth and resin, a scent that immediately slowed her breathing and loosened the tension she carried without realizing it. Luna leapt from the car and circled once, nose low to the ground, tail moving in a steady, relaxed rhythm. She knew this place as well as Emily did, perhaps better. The dog waited patiently as Emily locked the car, then trotted ahead when given the signal, staying close but always slightly in front, as if guiding the way. Emily followed the narrow dirt path that curved gently into the trees, her boots sinking softly into the ground with each step. This trail was her trail. She had walked it so many times that she no longer needed to think about where it led or how long it would take. The first stretch ran alongside a shallow creek, its water clear enough to reveal smooth stones beneath the surface. Further on, the path rose slightly, winding between tall trees whose trunks were thick with moss. Emily could have walked this route with her eyes closed, counting the minutes by the way the light shifted and the sounds changed. Normally, the familiarity comforted her. Today, however, something felt subtly different. It was not a dramatic sense of danger or a sudden rush of fear, just a faint impression that the forest was quieter than usual. She realized she could not hear birdsong, or at least not as much of it. Luna had slowed her pace, glancing back more often than she usually did, her ears flicking toward sounds Emily could not hear. Emily told herself it was nothing. The forest changed constantly, even when the path remained the same. Some days were louder, some quieter. Some days carried the scent of rain even under a clear sky. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and continued forward, letting her thoughts drift as they often did during these walks. The rhythm of her steps and the steady presence of Luna were usually enough to quiet her mind. As she reached a familiar bend where the trail split briefly before rejoining, she paused. One branch of the path veered off slightly, narrower and less defined, disappearing into thicker undergrowth. She had noticed it before, but had never taken it. There had never been a reason to. Her routine did not include detours. Still, she found herself standing there longer than usual, staring at the less traveled route as if it were asking something of her. She checked her phone again out of habit. No signal. She slipped it back into her pocket and looked around, taking in her surroundings more carefully than she normally would. The trees here were older, their bark rough and scarred. The ground was uneven, dotted with exposed roots that twisted like veins across the soil. The air felt heavier, cooler, and there was a faint smell she couldn't quite place, something damp and metallic that didn't belong to the creek. Luna stopped and turned toward the narrow path, her posture shifting from relaxed curiosity to alert focus. She sniffed the air, then took a few cautious steps forward, stopping again to look back at Emily. It was unusual behavior for her. Luna rarely showed interest in anything beyond the main trail unless there was something truly unfamiliar. Emily felt a small ripple of unease, followed immediately by an unexpected spark of excitement. The thought came unbidden and simple. Maybe it's time to see something new. The idea surprised her. She had come to the forest precisely because it was predictable, because it offered the same comfort every day. And yet, standing there at the edge of the familiar, she felt the weight of routine pressing down on her, not unpleasant, but limiting. She considered turning back, continuing along the path she knew so well. Nothing required her to explore further. She had already found what she came for: quiet, fresh air, the company of her dog. But the narrow trail remained before her, subtle and unassuming, and the longer she looked at it, the more it seemed to invite her forward. Emily took a slow breath and made a small, deliberate decision. She would only go a little way, she told herself, just enough to satisfy her curiosity, then she would turn back. She tightened her grip on the leash and followed Luna as the dog stepped cautiously onto the narrower path. The undergrowth brushed against her legs as she moved forward, and within a few steps, the sounds of the main trail faded behind her. As the forest closed in, the light dimmed further, and Emily became acutely aware that she had crossed an invisible line. The path behind her was already less clear than it had been moments before, and ahead the trail seemed to dissolve into the trees. She glanced back once more, committing the direction to memory, then faced forward again. Neither she nor Luna knew it yet, but this small deviation from routine, this single step away from the familiar, had already set something irreversible in motion. The forest, silent and ancient, received them without resistance, and the ordinary walk Emily had taken so many times before began to transform into something she would never forget. The narrow trail swallowed them quickly. Within minutes of leaving the familiar path behind, Emily felt as though the forest had rearranged itself around her, closing ranks in a way it never had before. Branches hung lower here, brushing against her shoulders and catching in her hair. The ground dipped and rose unevenly, forcing her to watch every step, and the soft, well-worn dirt of the main trail gave way to damp soil scattered with roots and stones. Each movement forward felt deliberate now, earned rather than automatic. Luna moved more slowly than usual, her nose close to the ground, her tail no longer swinging with easy confidence. She stopped often, sniffing the air, then continued again, as if following a scent only she could perceive. Emily shortened the leash without quite realizing she was doing it. The silence pressed in more heavily the farther they went. Not the peaceful quiet she was used to, but something thicker, more watchful. It reminded her of the pause before a storm, when the world seemed to hold its breath. She glanced back over her shoulder, expecting to see the familiar opening where the main trail lay, but the view behind her was already blurred by foliage. Leaves and branches obscured the way back, and for the first time that day, she felt a prickle of doubt. She forced herself to stop and take stock, turning slowly in a full circle. The forest looked the same in every direction, a repeating pattern of trunks and shadows that offered no obvious landmarks. She tried to fix the position of the sun in her mind, noting its angle through the canopy, and told herself she could retrace her steps if necessary. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone again. The screen lit up briefly, then dimmed as it searched in vain for a signal. No bars. She slipped it away with a small frown, reminding herself that she had walked for years without relying on technology. Still, the absence of that silent connection to the outside world made her feel more exposed than she liked. They continued on, the trail narrowing further until it was barely more than a suggestion, a slight disturbance in the undergrowth where something or someone had once passed. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and scarred, bark peeling away in places to reveal pale wood beneath. Moss clung to everything, softening sharp edges and swallowing fallen branches whole. The air was cooler, and the faint metallic scent Emily had noticed earlier grew stronger, mingling with the smell of wet leaves and decay. Luna stopped suddenly, her body going rigid. Emily nearly stumbled into her, catching herself just in time. The dog's ears were perked forward, her gaze fixed on something deeper in the woods. Emily followed her line of sight, but all she could see was a dense wall of trees and shadow. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Emily listened carefully, straining to pick out any sound that might explain Luna's reaction. There was nothing obvious, no footsteps or voices, no snap of twigs. only the distant murmur of water somewhere far off and the faint rustle of leaves high above. "It's okay," Emily murmured, more to herself than to the dog. Luna did not relax, but after a moment she lowered her head and took a tentative step forward. Emily followed, though her heart had begun to beat faster, a steady thump she could feel in her chest. She told herself again that there was nothing inherently dangerous about a quiet forest. Animals lived here, unseen and mostly harmless. The fear she felt was her own imagination, fed by unfamiliar surroundings. As they moved on, Emily began to notice subtle signs that this part of the forest was not as untouched as it appeared at first glance. A fallen log lay across their path, its ends unnaturally straight, as if cut long ago by human hands. Nearby, stones had been arranged in a rough line that seemed too deliberate to be the work of nature alone. She slowed her pace, studying these details with growing interest. Someone had been here before. Someone had left traces, faint but persistent, that the forest had not yet completely erased. The realization stirred a conflicting mix of emotions. On one hand, it reassured her. Human presence, even long past, made the place feel less wild, less unknown. On the other hand, it raised questions she hadn't considered before. Why would anyone come this far into the woods? What had they been doing here, and why had they left? Luna veered slightly to the right, tugging gently on the leash. Emily followed, stepping over a tangle of roots and ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. The ground sloped downward, and the air grew noticeably damper. The smell changed again, sharper now, carrying an undercurrent of something old and closed off, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in years. Emily wrinkled her nose, instinctively uneasy. She paused to take another look at her surroundings, committing as much as she could to memory. A distinctive tree with a split trunk stood nearby, its bark marked by a long, pale scar. A large rock, half buried and streaked with lichen, rested at the edge of a shallow depression. She told herself that if she needed to turn back, these would guide her. Still, the path ahead seemed to draw her onward, and she found herself reluctant to abandon it now that she had come this far. A faint sound reached her ears then, so subtle she almost dismissed it. It was not loud enough to identify clearly, but it carried a rhythm that didn't quite match the natural sounds of the forest. Emily stopped again, holding her breath. The sound came again, a distant, hollow echo, like wood knocking against wood or metal shifting under pressure. Luna lifted her head, ears twitching, and let out a low, uncertain whine. Emily's first instinct was to turn back. The rational part of her mind listed all the reasons why that was the sensible choice. She was alone, far from the main trail, with no phone signal and daylight slowly waning. Whatever lay ahead could wait. Curiosity was not worth risking her safety. And yet, she didn't move. The sound, whatever it was, had ignited something deeper than fear. It stirred the same part of her that had brought her to this town in the first place, that had driven her away from a life that felt too crowded and predictable. She wanted to understand what she was hearing, to see for herself what lay hidden in this quiet corner of the woods. She compromised with herself, as she often did. Just a little farther, she decided. Just enough to satisfy her curiosity. If the trail ended, or the sound grew clearer, she would reassess. With a quiet command, she urged Luna forward, keeping her steps slow and cautious. The forest seemed to respond to her decision by growing denser still. The trees stood closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that filtered the light into a dim green haze. The air felt heavy against her skin, and the ground underfoot was soft, almost spongy, forcing her to adjust her balance with each step. She became acutely aware of her own movements, the sound of her breathing, the faint crunch of leaves beneath her boots. Then, without warning, the trees ahead thinned abruptly. Emily stepped out of the shadows and into a small clearing, and the sight before her made her stop short. The clearing was not large, but it was unmistakably altered by human hands. At its edge stood a structure that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, perhaps longer. It was little more than a dark shape at first, half hidden by vines and sagging under the weight of time, but as Emily took a step closer, its form became clearer. Luna froze beside her, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the structure ahead. Emily's pulse quickened as she took in the details, a sense of unease settling over her even as curiosity flared brighter than ever. Whatever lay ahead was no longer just a suggestion of past human presence. It was tangible, undeniable, and it marked a clear boundary between the familiar forest she knew and something far more mysterious waiting beyond. She did not know it yet, but this clearing was only the beginning. The faint sounds, the strange smells, the subtle signs along the way had all been leading her here, drawing her deeper into a place where the forest silence concealed secrets that had been buried, quite literally, beneath layers of earth and time. Emily stood at the edge of the clearing longer than she realized, her body still, her mind racing. The structure before her did not announce itself dramatically. It did not loom or dominate the space. Instead, it seemed to crouch there, low and weary, as if it had grown tired of being noticed. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a dark mass tangled in vines and shadow, but the longer she stared, the more its shape resolved into something unmistakably man-made. It was a wooden shed, or what remained of one. Time had stripped it of any dignity it might once have possessed. The walls leaned inward at odd angles, boards warped and split by years of moisture and frost. Most of the black paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind gray, splintered wood that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding trees. The roof sagged in the middle, one corner completely collapsed, exposing rotted beams beneath. It looked as though a strong wind might finish what time had started and bring the whole thing down. Luna let out a low, uncertain sound, somewhere between a growl and a whine. Emily placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension in her muscles. The clearing itself was oddly quiet. No insects buzzed through the air, no birds darted between the branches. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through this space, as if the forest itself was wary of what lingered here. Emily took a cautious step forward, then another, her boots crunching softly on dry leaves and fragments of bark. The shed did not change, did not react, but she felt a subtle shift within herself as she approached. This was no longer abstract curiosity. This was evidence. Someone had built this place. Someone had chosen this clearing, far from roads and towns, and had left their mark behind. She circled the shed slowly, careful to keep her distance from the sagging walls. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. Rusted nails protruded from the wood at dangerous angles. One door hung open, its hinges frozen in a permanent twist, revealing a dark interior choked with debris. Emily did not step inside. She did not need to. From where she stood, she could see enough to know there was nothing of value left within. Broken tools lay half buried under leaves and dirt, their handles snapped, their metal eaten away by corrosion. A length of chain lay coiled near the back wall, orange with rust, as if it had not been touched in decades. The shed alone might have been dismissed as the remnants of some forgotten logging operation or an old hunting outpost, but something about its placement felt wrong. It was too isolated, too deliberately hidden. Emily straightened slowly, her gaze drifting past the shed and deeper into the clearing. That was when she saw the second structure. It stood farther back, partially obscured by trees and brush, but it was impossible to miss once she noticed it. Unlike the shed, this building was made of stone. Rough, uneven blocks stacked with care, darkened by age and streaked with moss. The walls were thick, far thicker than any simple forest cabin required. The roof, though partially collapsed at one corner, had once been solid and heavy, designed to endure more than weather alone. Emily felt her breath catch as she took it in. A stone house had no place here. Not this far from civilization, not without a road or even a visible path leading to it. Stone construction required effort, planning, and time. Whoever had built this had not done so casually. She hesitated, glancing down at Luna. The dog's attention was fixed on the stone building now, her body angled toward it, her ears forward. There was no excitement in her posture, no playful curiosity. It was the alert focus of an animal that sensed something unfamiliar, something that demanded caution. Emily moved forward slowly, her eyes scanning the ground for hazards. The clearing bore subtle signs of long-abandoned order. Stones arranged in rough lines, almost hidden beneath layers of moss and soil. A depression in the earth that might once have been a garden or a foundation for another structure. The forest had worked diligently to reclaim the space, but traces of human intent remained, stubborn and incomplete. As she approached the stone house, and its details became clearer. The windows were empty, their glass long gone, leaving dark, hollow openings that reflected nothing back. One wall bore a long crack that ran from near the roof down toward the ground, widened by years of freeze and thaw. Ivy crept along the stones, its tendrils slipping into gaps between the blocks as if prying them apart inch by inch. Emily stopped several feet from the building, a sense of unease settling deep in her chest. She could not explain it logically, but the house felt wrong in a way that went beyond its abandoned state. It did not feel empty, not occupied exactly, but heavy with absence, as though something significant had been removed, leaving behind a vacuum that pressed against her senses. She listened again, holding her breath. The faint, hollow sound she had heard earlier seemed to emanate from this place, though she could no longer be sure. It might have been nothing more than the wind shifting through broken stone and empty rooms. Still, she could not shake the feeling that the sound had meaning, that it had drawn her here intentionally. Emily took a few careful steps closer, angling toward one of the empty windows. She peered inside, squinting against the dimness. The interior was difficult to make out from this angle, but she could see vague shapes that suggested furniture, or what remained of it. A table, perhaps, a chair lying on its side. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed by footprints or recent movement. Her instincts warred within her. Part of her urged caution, reminding her that old buildings were unstable, prone to collapse without warning. Another part whispered questions she could not ignore. Why was the house connected to the shed? Why were both structures so thoroughly hidden? And most troubling of all, why did the place feel as though it had been designed not to be found? She stepped back from the window, her gaze drifting to the surrounding vegetation. That was when Luna suddenly pulled against the leash, drawing Emily's attention to a cluster of bushes near the side of the stone house. The dog sniffed vigorously at the ground, then began pawing at the undergrowth, her movements sharp and insistent. "Easy," Emily murmured, tightening her grip. Luna ignored her, focused entirely on whatever lay hidden beneath the leaves and tangled branches. Emily's unease spiked, but she followed, parting the foliage carefully with her free hand. The bushes were thick, thorny in places, and it took effort to see what had captured Luna's attention. At first, Emily saw nothing but dirt and roots. Then, a straight line caught her eye, too regular to be natural. She pushed aside more leaves, revealing the edge of something hard and flat beneath the soil. Kneeling carefully, she brushed away debris with her fingers, her heart pounding as more of the object emerged. It was metal. A flat, rectangular surface, coated in rust and moss, lay hidden beneath years of fallen leaves. At one end, a handle protruded slightly, worn smooth with age. Emily's breath came shallow as she traced the outline with her eyes. This was not debris. This was not a discarded object. It was a hatch. Her gaze lifted instinctively, following the line of bushes back toward the stone house. The placement was deliberate, concealed from casual view, yet close enough to the building to suggest a connection. The ground around the hatch dipped slightly, as if something beneath had settled over time. Luna sat back on her haunches, watching Emily intently, her earlier tension replaced by focused anticipation. Emily swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. A hidden hatch implied space below, a purpose that extended beyond what was visible. It explained the strange smells, the faint sounds, the lingering sense of unease that had followed her since she left the main trail. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and took a step back to see the area more clearly. As she did, her foot struck something solid behind her. She looked down and froze. A staircase descended into the ground, its upper steps barely visible beneath layers of moss and dirt. The wood was dark and swollen, edges rounded by rot, but its shape was unmistakable. It led downward, disappearing into shadow beneath the metal hatch. Emily felt a chill run through her despite the cool air. The clearing, the shed, the stone house, the hidden stairway, all of it formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. This place had been designed with intention. It had been built to conceal, to protect something from view. She stood there in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. Turning back now felt suddenly impossible. Whatever lay beneath that hatch was the reason this place existed at all, the secret that tied the abandoned structures together. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was standing at the threshold of something far larger than a forgotten building in the woods. The forest remained quiet, offering no guidance, no warning. Only the hidden staircase waited, patient and dark, inviting her to choose whether she would leave this mystery buried or descend and uncover whatever had been hidden there for so long. For a long moment, Emily did nothing at all. She stood at the edge of the half-buried stairs as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if the forest had quietly rearranged itself and placed a trapdoor into another world where none should exist. The stone house loomed to her left, its empty windows like dark sockets staring without interest, while the sagging shed behind her seemed to crouch lower in the afternoon light, ashamed of its own decay. Between them, in the narrow strip of brush that had hidden it for so long, the staircase descended into the earth with a strange, stubborn certainty. It did not look like something that had simply happened. It looked like something that had been built and then carefully forgotten. Luna remained close, her body tight with alertness. She did not bark or lunge forward, as Emily might have expected if the dog were merely excited by a new smell. Instead, she watched with the tense patience of an animal listening to a frequency beyond human hearing. Emily could feel that tension traveling up the leash, a faint tremor that made her aware of her own grip. The leash was a thin line between them, and Emily suddenly imagined it as something more. A tether keeping her anchored to the daylight, while the stairway offered a different kind of gravity. The sensible part of her mind spoke first, crisp and relentless. This was a terrible idea. She was alone. There was no signal. The structures were unstable, and anything beneath them would be worse. A staircase that had rotted at the top could collapse completely under her weight. A hatch hidden under moss and dirt could trap her if it closed. There could be animals below. There could be people below. Even if there was nothing alive down there, there could be rusted nails, broken boards, air so stale that breathing became a problem. This was not a movie, not a story told in a warm voice to an audience far away. It was her in the woods, with the afternoon sliding quietly toward evening. And yet, the other voice, softer but persistent, rose beneath the warnings. It was the voice that had led her down the narrow trail in the first place. It was not reckless exactly. It was curious. It asked questions that refused to be smothered. If she walked away now, she would carry those questions back to her car and then back into her house, where they would sit in the corners of her mind and watch her in the quiet hours. Why was there a stone house here? Why was there a hidden hatch? Who had built it, and what had they hidden? The forest had shown her a secret, and a part of her felt that secrets, once revealed, demanded an answer. Emily forced herself to inhale slowly, drawing the cool air deep into her lungs until her heartbeat steadied. She looked around as if the trees might offer advice. The clearing remained still. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in long, slanted shafts, illuminating floating dust and drifting pollen, indifferent to her dilemma. No distant voices carried through the woods. No footsteps approached. There was only the faint murmur of water far away and the soft shifting of leaves overhead. She crouched near the stairway and examined it more closely, trying to turn fear into practical observation. The steps were wooden, darkened by moisture and age, their edges rounded and softened by rot. Thick moss clung to the boards, spilling over the sides like green fur. In places, weeds had rooted between the steps, their thin stems pushing upward as if the earth itself were trying to reclaim the structure. The lower steps disappeared into shadow, but the upper portion told her enough. The staircase had been here for a very long time, long enough for the forest to treat it as part of itself. The hatch lay at the base of the upper steps, partially covered by a mat of wet leaves and tangled vines. Its metal surface was mottled with rust and grime, but beneath the corrosion, Emily could see the faint suggestion of a seam, a clean line where it met the frame. A handle protruded near one edge, worn smooth by use, as if many hands had gripped it before time swallowed the place. That smoothness unsettled her more than the rust. Rot and decay made sense. Evidence of repeated human touch did not. She stood and pulled her phone from her pocket once more, not because she expected a signal to suddenly appear, but because she needed to feel that she had done everything possible to be careful. The screen glowed pale in her hand. Still no bars. She opened her message thread with her friend anyway and typed a brief update, keeping it simple, as if simplicity could tame the strangeness of what she was seeing. Found an abandoned house and shed off the main trail. No signal. Will head back soon. She hit send and watched the message sit there, unsent, marked by a small hollow icon that might as well have been a shrug. Her mouth tightened. She slipped the phone away, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small water bottle, taking a sip to ground herself in something ordinary. When she replaced it, she hesitated and then took the phone out again, angling it carefully, taking photographs of the stairway from different angles, of the hatch beneath the leaves, of the stone house behind it, and the shed beyond. She recorded a short video, too, panning slowly across the clearing, narrating in a low voice the date and approximate time as if making an official statement. The sound of her own words in the quiet felt strange and too loud, but she continued anyway. If something happened, she wanted evidence. She wanted proof that she had not imagined this place. Then she did something even more practical, something she had once read in an article about hikers who got lost. She chose a tree near the edge of the clearing, one with a distinctive split trunk, and scratched a small mark into its bark with a key from her pocket. It was not a deep cut, but it would stand out if she needed to retrace her steps. She placed a small stone at the base of the tree, then another farther along the route she had come from, creating a subtle line of breadcrumbs that might guide her back. Only after these small acts of caution did she return to the hatch. Emily stepped down onto the first stair carefully, testing its strength before shifting her weight. The wood gave slightly under her boot, a soft, unsettling flex, but it held. She moved down another step, then stopped again, feeling the dampness seep through the sole. Luna hovered at the top, leaning forward as if wanting to follow, then looking up at Emily with an expression that seemed almost pleading. "No," Emily whispered, and the word came out firmer than she intended. She could not risk the dog slipping or getting trapped below. Luna was her responsibility, her companion, and her safest link to the surface. Emily climbed back up 2 steps and looped the leash around the split-trunk tree, tying it in a way that left Luna enough slack to sit comfortably, but not enough to run into the brush. She ran her fingers through the dog's fur, lingering there for a moment, drawing courage from the warmth. "Stay," she told her softly. "Stay right here." Luna did not like it. That was clear. She let out a low sound, half protest and half warning, but she stayed. Her eyes followed Emily's every move. Emily returned to the hatch and brushed away the leaves and vines with her hands. The vegetation came away reluctantly, damp and cold, leaving streaks of soil on her skin. Beneath it, the metal surface looked darker than she expected, almost black in the deeper rusted patches. The handle was indeed smooth, polished by years of use, and when Emily wrapped her fingers around it, it felt strangely cold, as if the metal had been holding on to the chill of the earth. She pulled. Nothing happened. She adjusted her grip and pulled harder, bracing her feet against the steps for leverage. The handle slid in her grasp, the smoothness betraying her, and her fingers slipped off with a sharp sting. Her heart jumped. She wiped her palm against her jeans and tried again, clenching her teeth. The hatch did not move. It was as if it had fused with the frame, locked in place by rust and time. Emily stood still, breathing hard, and tried to think. The obvious answer was to stop. The hatch was sealed for a reason, and the forest had done its work to keep it that way, but curiosity had already wrapped itself around her mind like the vines she had torn away. She scanned the clearing, looking for anything that might help, something she could use as a tool without putting herself in more danger. Near the shed, half hidden beneath a fallen beam, she spotted a length of metal, long and straight. It took effort to pull it free. The beam shifted slightly, sending a small cascade of dust and rotten wood into the air. Emily froze, watching for any sign that the shed might collapse, but it remained stubbornly upright. She dragged the metal piece toward the stairway, realizing as she moved it that it was a steel pipe, heavy and cold, the sort that might once have been a part of an old structure or plumbing system. Back at the hatch, she positioned the pipe beneath the handle, wedging it carefully to create leverage. Her hands shook slightly as she tested the setup. This was, she knew, the point where her actions crossed from simple exploration into deliberate entry. If she opened the hatch, she would not be able to pretend that she had merely stumbled across something. She would have chosen to open it. Emily swallowed and pressed down on the pipe. At first, nothing. The pipe flexed slightly. The handle did not budge. She shifted her footing and tried again, using her body weight. The pipe bit into the dirt, and her boot slipped a fraction on the mossy step. She caught herself, heart hammering, then tried once more, pressing down harder, feeling the strain in her arms and shoulders. On the third attempt, there was a sound that cut through the clearing like a crack. A sharp, metallic groan, followed by the faint pop of something breaking its hold. The hatch moved, only a few millimeters at first, but enough to make Emily's breath catch. She pressed again, carefully, steadily, and the hatch lifted further, scraping against the frame with a long, reluctant scream of rusted metal. A thin seam of darkness opened beneath it, and with it came a rush of cold air that smelled of damp stone and old rot. The scent hit her like a physical thing, sharper and deeper than anything above ground. It carried the unmistakable odor of a place that had been sealed, a place where air had stagnated and gathered the heavy breath of time. Emily froze, hand still on the pipe, listening. For a moment, she thought she heard something from below, a faint shifting sound, but it might have been nothing more than the hatch settling or the echo of her own movement. Luna whined above, a soft, anxious sound that tightened Emily's stomach. She lifted the hatch fully and propped it open with the pipe, positioning it so that it could not swing shut easily. Beneath the hatch, the opening yawned wide, the edges lined with metal. Darkness filled it completely, swallowing the light from above like water swallowing a stone. Emily leaned forward slightly and shone her phone's flashlight into the hole. A staircase descended into the earth, steeper and narrower than the one above. The first few steps were wooden, their surfaces slick with moisture. Beyond those steps, she could see hints of rough stone or packed earth forming walls that narrowed into a corridor. The beam of light reached only so far before it was swallowed by darkness, but it was enough to confirm what her mind had already guessed. This was not a shallow storage pit. This was a passageway. Emily straightened slowly. Her mouth felt dry. Every warning she had tried to set aside returned now with sharper edges. A tunnel could collapse. A tunnel could flood. A tunnel could hide animals or people. She pictured herself slipping on a wet step and falling. Pictured the hatch swinging shut and leaving her trapped. Pictured the phone's battery dying and plunging her into blackness so complete it would feel like blindness. She turned her head toward Luna, who stood at the top of the stairs, straining against the leash, eyes wide and fixed on the open hatch. The dog's entire body radiated unease. It was the clearest warning Emily had, more honest than her curiosity, and more reliable than her pride. "I should go back," Emily whispered, and the words sounded true. Yet she did not close the hatch. Instead, she took another slow breath and checked her phone battery. It was still more than half full. She adjusted the strap of her backpack so it sat tighter against her shoulders, then removed a small pocket knife and clipped it to the front strap for easy access, though she knew the gesture was mostly symbolic. She tested the hatch again, pressing gently to make sure the pipe held it open. The metal creaked but stayed in place. Emily stood there for several seconds, letting the moment stretch, giving herself every opportunity to change her mind. The forest remained silent. The stone house watched with empty windows. The shed sagged in patient decay. The tunnel waited. At last, with a quiet determination that felt both frightening and inevitable, she placed one foot on the first step below the hatch. The wood was slick and cold. She shifted her weight carefully, then placed her other foot beside it, gripping the edge of the opening with one hand. The air down there was markedly colder, wrapping around her skin like a damp cloth. She took another step, and this time the wood beneath her boot gave a soft, ominous crack. The sound was not loud, but it echoed upward, amplified by the hollow space below. Emily froze instantly, muscles locked, heart surging into her throat. Above her, the hatch trembled slightly in its frame, as if reacting to the vibration. The pipe held, but the metal shifted with a low creak that made her imagine it slipping free. For one terrible second, she pictured the hatch falling shut, sealing her beneath the ground, leaving Luna barking above an unyielding slab of metal. She pictured herself pounding on it in the dark until her hands bled, while the forest kept her secret the way it had kept this place hidden for so long. Emily tightened her grip, forcing her breathing to remain steady. She lifted her foot carefully from the cracked step and tested the next one, distributing her weight as lightly as possible. The tunnel below seemed to drink in the light from her phone, leaving the edges of the world dim and uncertain. Behind her, above the open hatch, daylight still existed, bright and ordinary, but already it felt far away. She hesitated again, listening to the hush below, and then, with a slow, careful motion, she began to descend. The first few steps beneath the hatch felt unreal, as though Emily had crossed a boundary that did not fully exist in the physical world. Above her, daylight still spilled weakly through the opening, catching on the edges of the metal frame and the slick surfaces of the upper steps. Below her, darkness pressed upward, thick and heavy, swallowing the beam of her phone's flashlight almost as soon as it left her hand. She moved slowly, testing each step before committing her weight, acutely aware that a single mistake could send her tumbling into the unknown. The staircase descended at a steeper angle than she had expected. The wooden steps were narrow and uneven, their surfaces slick with moisture and coated in a thin layer of slime that made her boots slide slightly no matter how carefully she placed them. She kept one hand pressed against the wall, feeling rough stone beneath her fingertips, cold and damp. The texture reassured her in a strange way. Stone meant intention. Someone had carved or built this place, shaping it with purpose, and that meant the tunnel was not a natural pit waiting to collapse without warning, or at least that was what she told herself. As she moved farther down, the light from the open hatch faded until it was nothing more than a pale square above her head. The air changed noticeably with every step. It grew colder, heavier, carrying the unmistakable scent of long confinement. It smelled of wet earth and mold, but there was something else beneath it, a deeper, more complex odor that made her stomach tighten. It reminded her vaguely of old basements and forgotten storage rooms, places where objects absorbed the smell of time itself. Emily paused on a narrow landing where the wooden steps ended and the passageway leveled out. She stood still, listening. The silence was different down here. It was not the layered quiet of the forest, full of distant life and subtle movement. This silence was dense and enclosed, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere ahead and the sound of her own breathing, which seemed too loud in the confined space. She lifted her phone higher, angling the light forward. The beam illuminated a corridor that stretched away into darkness, its walls formed from rough stone and packed earth. In places, wooden supports had been driven into the walls and ceiling, their surfaces darkened and swollen with age. Some of the beams were cracked, others bowed slightly under unseen pressure, but they remained in place, stubbornly holding the tunnel open. The floor was uneven, scattered with small stones and patches of thick mud that glistened wetly in the light. Emily took a cautious step forward, then another, moving slowly, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if the tunnel might press inward at any moment. She kept her free hand outstretched in front of her, fingers spread, ready to catch herself if she stumbled. Every sense felt sharpened, her awareness focused entirely on the narrow slice of space illuminated by her phone. The smell grew stronger as she went on, coiling around her senses. It was not the sharp, clean scent of fresh soil, but something older and more stagnant. She breathed shallowly, fighting the urge to cover her mouth and nose. Each inhale carried the same message. This place had been sealed, used, and abandoned long enough for the air itself to decay. She tried to estimate how far she had gone, counting her steps as she had learned to do on long hikes. 20 steps, 30, 40. The tunnel did not curve or branch, at least not yet. It ran straight ahead, unbroken, as if guiding her toward something specific. The thought made her uneasy. She did not like the idea that this place had a destination. At one point, her boot slid on a patch of mud and she stumbled, catching herself against the wall with a sharp intake of breath. The sound echoed down the corridor, bouncing back to her in a distorted whisper. She froze, heart pounding, listening for any response from the darkness ahead. For a moment, she thought she heard something else in the echo, a faint shifting sound that did not belong to her movement. She held her breath, counting the seconds in her head, but nothing followed. The tunnel remained still, indifferent to her fear. Emily forced herself to keep moving. Turning back now felt more frightening than continuing. The staircase behind her, slick and unstable, loomed in her imagination as a greater danger than the unknown ahead. She focused on placing one foot carefully in front of the other, on the steady circle of light cast by her phone, on the simple act of forward motion. As she progressed, the walls began to change subtly. The stone grew smoother in places, as if shaped by tools rather than left rough by chance. Here and there, she noticed marks that might have been made by human hands, shallow grooves and scratches that suggested repeated contact. She brushed her fingers over one such mark as she passed, feeling a strange sense of connection to whoever had once walked this same path. The thought that she was following in the footsteps of someone long gone both comforted and unsettled her. The tunnel seemed to stretch on without end. Time lost its meaning in the darkness, measured only by the slow drain on her phone's battery and the ache beginning to settle into her legs. She could no longer see the pale square of daylight behind her. When she glanced back, the tunnel swallowed the light completely, offering no hint of the way out. A chill ran through her at the realization. If she turned around now, she would be navigating by memory alone. She stopped again, leaning against the wall, and closed her eyes briefly, pressing her forehead to the cold stone. The dampness seeped into her skin, grounding her in the physical reality of the place. She listened to the sound of water dripping somewhere ahead, slow and rhythmic, and tried to steady her breathing. Panic would be her enemy here. Panic would make her careless. When she opened her eyes and raised the phone again, something caught her attention. Far ahead, at the very edge of the beam's reach, there was a subtle change in the darkness. It was not a shape or an object, but a difference in quality, a thinning of the black that suggested space beyond. She squinted, angling the light, and her heart gave a small, hopeful leap. There was light ahead. It was faint, barely more than a suggestion, but it was unmistakable. A pale glow filtered into the tunnel from somewhere in the distance, too steady to be a reflection and too diffuse to be artificial. Daylight. The realization sent a rush of relief through her, loosening the tight knot of tension in her chest. The tunnel did not go on forever. It had an end. Emily moved forward more quickly now, though she was careful not to rush. The glow grew stronger with each step, resolving into narrow beams that slipped through gaps ahead. The air changed as well, losing some of its heaviness, carrying a fresher note beneath the mold and earth. She found herself breathing more deeply, encouraged by the promise of open space. As she drew closer, the source of the light became clearer. It spilled through two rectangular openings set into a wooden structure that spanned the width of the tunnel. A door. The thought struck her with a mix of surprise and apprehension. She slowed again, approaching with caution. The door was old, its wood darkened and warped, but it was solid, fitted into a rough stone frame. Two small windows had been cut into its upper half. One was broken, jagged glass still clinging to the frame, while the other was clouded with dust and grime, obscuring whatever lay beyond. Emily stopped a few feet away and listened. The tunnel behind her was silent. Ahead, beyond the door, she could hear faint sounds that did not belong underground. The distant rustle of leaves, perhaps, or the whisper of wind. The presence of those sounds sent a shiver of anticipation through her. She was close to the surface again. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch the door. The wood felt rough beneath her fingers, flaking slightly at the edges. She traced the outline of one of the windows, peering through the broken one. Beyond it, she could see only a blur of light and shadow, shapes that suggested a larger space but refused to resolve into anything recognizable. Her hand moved down, searching for the handle. It took a moment to find, set low and partially hidden by grime. When her fingers closed around it, she felt another jolt of cold, though not as intense as the metal of the hatch above. She hesitated, her grip tightening as she weighed the implications. Opening this door meant committing fully to whatever lay on the other side. It meant stepping out of the tunnel and into a place that was clearly part of the same hidden complex she had stumbled upon. Emily glanced back once more, though she could see nothing behind her now but darkness. Somewhere above, Luna waited, tied to a tree in a quiet clearing, unaware of how far Emily had gone. The thought of the dog anchored her, reminding her of the world she had left behind and the one she would need to return to. She turned back to the door, drew a steadying breath, and pressed down on the handle. The door moved with surprising ease, swinging inward on hinges that creaked softly in protest. Light flooded the tunnel, forcing Emily to squint as her eyes adjusted. She stepped forward cautiously, crossing the threshold. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a space that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. As the door closed behind her with a dull thud, Emily found herself standing inside the abandoned stone house. The realization sent a ripple of shock through her. The tunnel she had followed did not lead to some distant exit or hidden cave. It led directly here, to the very building she had been studying from outside. She turned slowly, taking in her surroundings, and felt a strange disorientation settle over her. The house seemed larger from the inside, its walls enclosing a space that felt charged with history and secrets. Emily stood there for several seconds, letting the implications sink in. The stone house and the tunnel were not separate discoveries. They were parts of the same design, connected deliberately, hidden together beneath the forest floor. Whatever purpose this place had once served, it had been carefully planned. Her sense of unease deepened, but it was accompanied now by a fierce curiosity. She had followed the tunnel to its end. She had crossed the threshold. The answers she sought were no longer buried beneath the earth. They were here, waiting in the quiet rooms of the house, ready to be uncovered by anyone brave or foolish enough to look for them. And despite the fear that lingered in her chest, Emily knew she was not going to turn back just yet. For a few heartbeats, Emily remained exactly where she was, standing just inside the doorway, as if her body needed time to accept what her eyes were seeing. The door behind her had closed with a dull, final sound, cutting off the tunnel and sealing her fully inside the stone house. The light here was different from the dim glow below ground. It was natural daylight, muted and dusty, filtering in through empty window frames and the single grimy pane that had somehow survived intact. The air felt heavy and stale, pressing against her lungs with a musty weight that carried the unmistakable scent of long abandonment. The house was silent in a way that felt deliberate. Not empty, not peaceful, but suspended, as though time itself had paused the moment its last inhabitant left. Emily slowly raised her phone, letting the flashlight add definition to the room, and took her first careful steps forward. The floor beneath her boots was littered with debris. Old newspapers, their pages yellowed and brittle, crumbled softly when she brushed them aside. Broken glass glittered faintly in the light, mixed with dirt and small fragments of stone that had fallen from the walls. Dust coated everything in a thick, uniform layer, undisturbed by footprints or movement. Each step Emily took left a clear mark behind her, a visible sign that she was the first person to walk here in a very long time. The furniture was still there, just as she had glimpsed from the window outside, but seeing it up close made her chest tighten. A wooden table stood near the center of the room, one leg slightly shorter than the others, causing it to lean at an awkward angle. Two chairs flanked it, one upright, the other tipped onto its side as if knocked over in haste. Against one wall stood a tall cabinet with its doors hanging open, shelves inside empty except for a few warped scraps of wood that might once have supported something heavier. Emily moved slowly, her gaze drifting from object to object. There were no personal items inside. No photographs, no clothing, no dishes left in the open. It was as if someone had stripped the house of anything that might reveal who they were, leaving behind only what was too large or too worthless to bother with. The absence felt intentional, and that realization unsettled her more than the decay. She stepped closer to the table and ran her fingers lightly across its surface. The dust came away in a thick streak, revealing dark, scarred wood beneath. For a moment, she imagined someone sitting there, leaning over the table under the weak glow of a lamp, listening for sounds from the forest outside. The image was so vivid it made her pause, her hand hovering above the table as if she might disturb something fragile and unseen. The smell in the house was stronger than it had been outside, a layered odor of mold, damp stone, and something metallic that lingered at the back of her throat. It was the same scent she had noticed in the tunnel, now unmistakable and pervasive. Emily resisted the urge to cover her mouth and nose, focusing instead on steady breathing. She needed her senses clear. She crossed the room toward a doorway at the far end, peering into what might once have been a small bedroom. The space was bare. A collapsed bed frame lay against one wall, its metal springs exposed and twisted. The floor was uneven here, one corner sagging slightly, and the walls were stained with dark streaks where moisture had seeped in over the years. Again, there were no personal belongings, no hint of the life that had once occupied the space. Emily backed out slowly and returned to the main room, her awareness sharpening with every step. The house did not feel random or chaotic. It felt curated in its emptiness, as though someone had chosen exactly what to leave behind and what to remove. The thought sent a chill through her. Whoever had lived here had been careful, deliberate. Her eyes caught on something near the far wall, partially obscured by a pile of fallen debris. A staircase descended into darkness, its opening framed by rough stone. Emily's breath hitched slightly. She had known, logically, that there might be more beneath the house. The tunnel had already proven that, but seeing the staircase confirmed it in a way that tightened her stomach. She approached the stairs cautiously, shining her light down into the opening. The steps were narrow and steep, disappearing into shadow after only a few feet. The air rising from below was even colder than the air in the main room, carrying the same musty smell but stronger, heavier. It felt like standing at the mouth of a cellar that had not been opened in generations. Emily hesitated. She had already gone far beyond what she would have considered reasonable. She was deep inside an abandoned structure, connected to a hidden tunnel, in the middle of a forest where no one knew her exact location. Every sensible instinct urged her to turn back now, to leave the house as she had found it and return to the daylight, to Luna, to safety. But the staircase called to her with the same quiet insistence as the tunnel had. It felt like the final layer of the place, the deepest secret it held. And she knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that if she left now without looking, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Emily adjusted her grip on the phone and placed one foot on the first step. It creaked softly under her weight but held. She moved slowly, step by step, keeping her balance, her shoulders tense. The darkness closed in around her as she descended, the light from above fading until the stairs were illuminated only by the narrow beam of her flashlight. The space at the bottom of the stairs was larger than she had expected. It opened into a low-ceilinged room, its stone walls close and oppressive but solid. The floor was packed earth, uneven and cold beneath her boots. Emily swept the light across the room and her heart began to race. Something large sat in the far corner. At first, she could not tell what it was. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, its edges softened by time. As she crept closer, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the shape became clearer. It was rectangular, squat and solid, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, resting directly on the ground as if it had been placed there permanently. A safe. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Safes did not belong in abandoned houses hidden deep in the forest unless they contained something worth hiding. Emily knelt beside it, her movements cautious, and brushed her hand across the surface. Dust billowed into the air, making her cough softly. Beneath the grime, the metal was intact, dark but unbroken. She examined the front carefully, her light lingering on the details. A combination lock was set into the door, its numbers faint but visible. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling slightly. She tried the handle, expecting resistance, but to her surprise it moved. The door was not locked. Emily froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. For several seconds she simply stared at the handle as if it might suddenly change its mind and refuse to open. Slowly she pulled. The door swung open with a low metallic creak. What she saw inside made her breath catch. The safe was filled with stacks of banknotes, bundled neatly and wrapped in plastic. The light from her phone reflected off the smooth surfaces, revealing the familiar green and off-white patterns of U.S. currency. Emily reached out with shaking fingers and touched one of the bundles, half expecting it to dissolve into dust. It was real. Solid. There were far more bills than she could easily count, stacked tightly together. Her mind struggled to process the sight. Money like this did not simply get forgotten. It did not get left behind by accident. She estimated quickly, trying to stay calm, and guessed there was several $1,000s there, perhaps more. The discovery left her dizzy, her thoughts spiraling with questions she could not yet answer. She pushed the bundles aside carefully, searching for what else the safe might hold. Her fingers brushed against something hard and angular at the back. She shifted the money further, her heart racing, and revealed a small box nestled behind the stacks. It was metal, roughly circular in shape, about a foot in circumference, its surface dulled by age. A small keyhole sat at the front, an old key hung from the lock. Emily hesitated only a moment before turning it. The key moved stiffly, then clicked, and the lid opened. Inside, resting on a dark lining, lay a weapon. Emily's breath left her in a silent rush. She did not know much about firearms, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a revolver, and it was unlike any she had ever seen. The entire gun was made of gold, its surface catching the light in a way that felt almost obscene in the dim cellar. She reached out cautiously and lifted it, surprised by the weight. It was heavy, far heavier than she expected, pulling at her wrist as if resisting being moved. Her fingers found the cylinder, and with careful movements she opened it. 6 chambers stared back at her. 3 were empty. 3 held bullets. A chill ran through her. This was not a decorative piece, not a novelty. It was a functional weapon, and it had been used. Emily set it back into the box gently, her hands shaken, and closed the lid, locking it again with a soft click. Her gaze returned to the safe, drawn now to a dark shape tucked into the back corner. She leaned closer, the musty smell intensified, and realized it was a bag. A backpack, slumped and misshapen, its leather surface mottled with mold and age. The smell that rose from it was the same one she had noticed in the tunnel, now unmistakable. Emily pulled the bag out slowly, handling it with care. It was an old-school-style backpack, heavy despite its decayed appearance. Several small pockets lined the front, their zippers stiff and corroded. She unfastened the main compartment and peered inside. At first glance, she saw only papers, thick and folded, some wrapped in plastic, others loose. She took one out and unfolded it carefully. Her confusion deepened as she realized what she was holding. A passport. She pulled out another, and another. France, Germany, Brazil, Russia. Her heart began to pound harder with each one. The passports were from different countries, issued under different names, each with a photograph of a different man. Some looked older, others younger. Many bore Russian names. None were American. Emily sank back on her heels, the weight of the discovery settling over her like a physical pressure. This was no longer a simple mystery, no longer something she could dismiss or ignore. The money, the weapon, the passports, all pointed to a story far larger and darker than she had imagined. She looked around the cellar, the narrow walls, the low ceiling, the single safe hidden in the corner, and understood something fundamental. This place had not been abandoned by chance. It had been erased, and whatever truth lay behind it was not meant to be found. Emily did not remember climbing back up the stairs from the cellar, nor did she remember crossing the main room of the stone house again. Her movements felt automatic, guided by instinct rather than conscious thought. The images in her mind replayed themselves over and over with unsettling clarity. The stacks of money sealed in plastic, the impossible weight of the golden revolver, the open cylinder with 3 bullets still inside, and, above all, the passports, so many of them, each bearing a different face, a different name, a different country. Together, they formed a pattern she could not yet understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever she had found was dangerous, not in a physical sense alone, but in what it represented. She forced herself to stop near the doorway and take a long breath, steadying her hands. Panic would help no one. She needed to leave this place, and she needed to do so carefully. Before stepping outside, she turned slowly and took one last look at the interior of the house, committing as much as she could to memory. The arrangement of the furniture, the position of the stairs, the way the light fell through the windows. She raised her phone again and took several photographs, this time with deliberate care, documenting everything without touching anything else. The safe remained open in the cellar below, but she resisted the urge to close it. Let the authorities see it exactly as she had found it. When she finally stepped out into the clearing, the forest felt almost overwhelming in its normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, birdsong had returned, and a light breeze stirred the branches overhead. The contrast made her dizzy. For a moment, she wondered if the house behind her would vanish the moment she turned away, as if it had been a hallucination brought on by solitude and imagination. But when she looked back, it was still there, solid and silent, its stone walls unmoved by her discovery. Luna greeted her with frantic relief, whining softly and pulling against the leash. Emily knelt and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, pressing her face into the familiar fur. The simple, living warmth of Luna's body grounded her in a way nothing else could. She stayed like that for several seconds, letting her heart beat slow, letting the forest remind her that she was still alive and still free to leave. The walk back through the woods felt longer than it should have. Every sound made her turn her head. Every shifting shadow caught her attention. She kept replaying the road in her mind, checking off landmarks as she passed them, the split-trunk tree, the half-buried rock, the subtle line of stones that marked the edge of the clearing. The narrow trail widened eventually, and when she stepped back onto the familiar main path, she felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought her to tears. As she neared the parking area, her phone vibrated in her pocket. The sudden sound made her flinch. She pulled it out quickly, her heart racing, and saw that a signal bar had appeared. Almost immediately, a message sent notification followed, then another. The update she had tried to send earlier had finally gone through, along with a missed call from her friend. She did not call back right away. She needed a moment to think, to decide what she would say and how much. She sat in the car with the engine off, Luna curled up in the back seat, and stared out at the line of trees. The choice before her felt heavy, but it was also clear. She could not keep this to herself. The discovery was too large, too serious. Whatever she had uncovered belonged to more than just her curiosity. When she finally called her friend, the words came out in a rush. She explained that she had found something strange in the forest, an abandoned house connected to a tunnel, and that inside there were items she believed were connected to serious criminal activity. She avoided details over the phone, aware that even saying too much felt risky. Her friend listened in stunned silence, then urged her to go straight to the police. The police station in town was small, quiet, the kind of place where the officers knew most of the residents by name. Emily felt out of place as she stepped inside, still wearing her hiking clothes, dirt on her boots, and dried mud on her hands. She asked to speak with someone privately and was led into a modest office where a middle-aged detective sat behind a desk cluttered with files and coffee mugs. At first, the detective's expression was polite but skeptical. People came in with strange stories from time to time, especially in a town surrounded by wilderness. Emily began at the beginning, describing her usual walks, the decision to take a new route, the abandoned structures she had found. She spoke carefully, choosing her words, watching his face for any sign that he might dismiss her outright. That changed the moment she showed him the photographs. The detective leaned forward, his casual posture vanishing as he studied the images on her phone. The clearing, the stone house, the hidden stairway, the tunnel entrance, the cellar, the open safe. When he reached the photos of the money and the golden revolver, his jaw tightened. By the time he saw the passports laid out on the cellar floor, his skepticism had disappeared entirely. Emily was asked to wait while he stepped out of the room. When he returned, he was no longer alone. Another officer joined him, and then another. They asked her to repeat her story, this time in more detail, clarifying distances, directions, times. They asked her not to share the discovery with anyone else for the moment. Emily agreed, though the request made her uneasy. Within hours, a small team was assembled to accompany her back to the forest. The drive felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. When they reached the clearing, the officers moved with methodical precision, securing the area, photographing everything, marking positions. The house was entered carefully, the cellar examined with flashlights and equipment far more powerful than her phone. The following days passed in a blur. Emily was interviewed multiple times, each conversation peeling back another layer of the discovery. She learned that the money was real, though the amount was greater than she had initially estimated. The revolver was real as well, solid gold but fully functional, an unusual and highly valuable piece. The passports were the most troubling. Specialists confirmed that many of them were authentic, issued by legitimate authorities decades earlier. They were not crude forgeries. They were professional, precise, and deeply unsettling. Not long after, Emily noticed a shift in the tone of the investigation. New faces appeared at the police station, people who did not wear local uniforms and did not introduce themselves beyond a brief exchange of credentials. Questions became more specific, more careful. She was asked to sign documents acknowledging that certain details could not be shared publicly. Though no one explained everything outright, she understood that the case had grown beyond the scope of the town police. One evening, several weeks after her discovery, Emily received a call from a number she did not recognize. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled her to answer. The detective's voice was on the other end, familiar yet charged with an energy she had not heard before. He told her that they had made significant progress. The house, he explained, was not an ordinary hideout or criminal stash. It had been a long-term safe location used by a foreign intelligence operative during the Cold War. The passports belonged to carefully constructed identities, used to travel across borders without detection. The money and weapon were part of a contingency plan, meant to support escape or self-defense if the operative was compromised. Federal authorities had taken over much of the investigation, and through old archives and international cooperation, they had traced the operation back to its origin. The man who had used the house had operated under many names, but his real identity had finally been uncovered. He had died years earlier, his existence largely erased from official records. Emily listened in stunned silence as the detective explained that the case had been partially handed over to foreign authorities as well. The story did not end in the forest or even in the country. It stretched across decades and continents, woven into a chapter of history that most people only knew through textbooks and documentaries. When the call ended, Emily sat in her living room for a long time, staring at the darkened window. The forest lay somewhere beyond the town, quiet and unchanged, keeping its secrets as it always had. She had stumbled into a story that had begun long before she was born, and she could not yet see how it would end. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her life had been altered by a single decision to step off a familiar path, and there was no returning to the simplicity she had known before. The call from the detective lingered in Emily's mind long after the line went dead. His words echoed through the quiet of her living room, settling into the corners of the space the way dust settled on the abandoned furniture in the stone house. A foreign intelligence operative. The Cold War. Multiple identities. Decades of secrecy buried beneath the forest she had walked through so many times without a second thought. It all felt unreal, like a story she had overheard rather than a truth she had stepped into with her own boots. In the days that followed, life attempted to return to its previous rhythm, but the effort felt strained, artificial. Emily went to work, spoke to colleagues, smiled at familiar faces in town, yet everything seemed slightly distant, as though she were observing her own life from behind a pane of glass. The ordinary details that once grounded her now felt fragile, easily disrupted by the memory of how thin the boundary was between routine and revelation. The authorities remained in contact, though their communication was careful and measured. Emily was informed that the investigation had reached its final stages. The house and the land around it had been thoroughly examined, every room mapped, every hidden space documented. The tunnel had been measured and reinforced temporarily so that specialists could work safely inside it. Samples were taken, records were compiled, and then, slowly, the place was sealed again, this time deliberately and officially. Several weeks after the initial discovery, Emily was asked to come to the police station once more. The detective greeted her with the same calm professionalism she had come to associate with him, but there was a note of closure in his demeanor that had not been there before. They sat across from each other in the same small office where the story had begun, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the pauses between their words. He told her that the true name of the man who had used the stone house had finally been confirmed through international archives. His real identity had been hidden behind layers of aliases for most of his life, but the trail had eventually led to a single name, one that appeared only rarely in surviving records. The operative had been part of a long-term intelligence program that placed agents deep inside foreign territories, instructing them to live quietly, to disappear into ordinary landscapes, and to leave as little trace as possible. The passports Emily had found represented different phases of his life, different missions, different escapes. Some had been used briefly, others for years. The money in the safe had been accumulated slowly, meant to support him if he ever needed to vanish completely. The revolver, rare and extravagant, had been a final safeguard, both a weapon and a symbol of authority within the clandestine world he inhabited. The detective explained that the operative had died several years earlier, his death recorded under one of his lesser-known identities. With the easing of international tensions and improved relations between governments, authorities had agreed to cooperate in closing the case. The items recovered from the house were to be transferred to the country of the operative's origin, where surviving family members had been located. Emily listened quietly, absorbing the information. She felt no sense of triumph, no thrill at having uncovered a spy's hidden life. Instead, she felt a deep, unexpected sadness. The man behind the secrets had lived and died largely alone, his existence defined by concealment. The forest had been his refuge just as it had been hers, but for very different reasons. A few days later, Emily received a letter forwarded through official channels. It was brief and written in careful, formal language, but the sentiment was unmistakable. The operative's daughter, now an older woman living in a small town near Moscow, thanked Emily for bringing her father's hidden past to light. The letter did not justify his actions or condemn them. It simply acknowledged that a chapter long closed had finally been understood, and that the family was grateful to have answers, however late they came. Emily held the letter for a long time after reading it, tracing the lines of ink with her eyes. It struck her, then, that history was not made only of grand events and public figures, but of quiet lives lived in shadow, intersecting with ordinary people in moments neither side could have predicted. The forest itself did not remain untouched by the consequences of her discovery. Not long after the investigation concluded, Emily noticed changes along the route she used to hike. Official signs appeared near the old parking area, warning of restricted access beyond certain points. Heavy equipment arrived one morning, its presence jarring against the natural stillness. From a distance, she watched as the stone house was dismantled piece by piece, its walls carefully taken down to prevent collapse, its foundations filled in and covered with soil. The tunnel was sealed permanently. The hatch was removed, the stairway dismantled, and the ground leveled until there was no obvious sign that anything had ever existed beneath it. Within weeks, grass began to grow over the disturbed earth, and fallen leaves settled into the new contours. The forest resumed its slow, patient work of erasure. When Emily finally returned to hiking after a long absence, she did so with a different awareness. She stayed on the main trail, her steps measured, her senses alert. Luna, older now and calmer, walked at her side, occasionally glancing into the trees as if remembering something she could not quite place. They passed the area where the narrow trail had once branched off, but it was barely visible now, choked with undergrowth and fallen branches. If Emily had not known to look for it, she might have walked past without noticing anything at all. She paused there briefly, her gaze drifting into the dense green beyond, and felt a strange mixture of relief and loss. She understood now that the forest would always hold secrets. Some would remain buried forever, protected by time and chance. Others would surface only briefly, revealed to someone willing to step off the path and look closer. The difference lay not in the secrets themselves, but in the choices people made when they encountered them. Emily turned back towards the trail and continued walking, the sound of her footsteps blending once more with the quiet rhythm of the woods. The forest accepted her return without comment, offering the same filtered light and gentle silence it always had. And though she knew she would never walk these paths with the same innocence again, she also knew that the truth she had uncovered did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the land, to history, and to the quiet understanding that even the most ordinary routines could, without warning, open onto stories far larger than oneself. If this story kept you watching until the end, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch our other videos to uncover more hidden discoveries and true stories that start with an ordinary day and change everything. Share this video with someone